Hi, everyone. Welcome. Today, we are going to be speaking about Sufism and Shiism. Why are we going to be speaking about that? And first of all, what is Sufism, Shiism? That's the basic information for this little lecture. And this all starts from the fact that by 1500, the majority of the population in Anatolia was Muslim. Now, this is in marked contrast, of course, to the situation in 1071, before the Battle of Manzikert, when the majority of the population was Christian. And this goes back to our question of, well, what did it mean to be Muslim? What was the process of Islamization over those 4 centuries? How did it occur? And ultimately, what happened to the peoples of Anatolia? Were they displaced? Did they convert? What was that process of conversion? And in this case, I want to think about what is the nature of Islam that they converted to? What was Islam on the frontier in Anatolia at that time? And to do so, we're going to have to look, or at least understand, the multiple visions, or let's say forms of Islam. All of them are Islam. Everyone who subscribes to these forms of Islam considers themselves Muslim. In fact, they often combine all of them together. But this is just a way to think through different ways of being Muslim. Now, when we think of being Muslim, or we think about Islam, you might think about what you've learned in high school, or if you're Muslim, what you kind of learned from basic aqaid or belief texts, etc. And that is kind of the legalistic version of Islam, the sort of obligations you have towards God, which are expounded in what is called Islamic law. So you're supposed to pray 5 times a day, fast, to go on Hajj, and so forth. You have what are, the so-called pillars of Islam, and within that, a whole variety of other regulations of comportment, etc. These are all mostly prescribed in Islamic law, which doesn't just deal with interactions between humans, like, for example, when one person murders another or cheats another, etc., but also obligations between humans and God. Now, that is one part of Islam. It's a very pertinent part and very present. But on the frontier in Anatolia, there were other forms of Islam that were more salient, that were more present. And these were basically what we might call, as I'll talk about in a second, frontier Islam, which was composed often of Sufi Islam, local forms of Islam, and alongside that, we'll call it Shiism. Now, what is Sufism? Sufism comes from the word Sufi, and that is someone who wears suf, which is wool, because it was based in the medieval period, around the year 800. Initially, people would wear very simple, basic clothes made out of wool, and they would just wear these garments. And for that, they were called people who wore wool, or Sufis. But other words for them are dervishes or fakirs. Now, what is Sufism? It's let's say, a mystical approach to Islamic piety that emphasizes not just following the rules laid out in Islamic law, but having an experiential knowledge of God's unity or presence in this world. Now, there's various ways of achieving that knowledge, often through pious meditation, through asceticism. You can train yourself to be cognizant of God's unity. And there's a whole variety of different approaches and different means to do so. So this, for example, is a depiction of one wandering mendicant, a Sufi, who was basically a wandering beggar. Not all of them were beggars and so forth, but they would keep with them certain accessories, especially those devoted completely to the path of Sufism, like this guy here. You would have a begging bowl, which you can see on the bottom right, a stick/club, a cloak, and usually an animal skin to sit on. And of course, all of this is kind of not to be very luxurious. It's meant to be particularly poor and simple clothing. And those who devoted themselves to the path of Sufism, the Sufis, usually try to achieve their goals through basically what's known as asceticism, that is, depriving the body of the luxuries of the world and renouncing the material world in general. And often that comes also with renouncing other types of luxuries, not just material ones, but societal ones, right? So you want to remove yourself from society. You want to become dependent solely on God and not on, the respect that people show to you or your position or etc. Now, after initially in the 800s and so forth, Sufis were basically individuals. They were kind of individual mendicants or beggars, wanderers who wore kind of Sufi cloth and sometimes hung out with each other. But after 1100, Sufis began to be organized into orders, or what are called tariqas. Each order basically had a founder, and then there would be who would probably be dead, a leader who would carry on the way of the order. And they had specific rituals and accoutrements and things like that. So here we can see one, these would be Mevlevis. The leader or sheikh would be sitting in the center. These are different disciples. You can see there's basically different people playing musical instruments, as we'll see in a second. Now, within that, there are all sorts of different rituals that are meant to create remembrance of God. So this is, let's look at, this is one type of ritual apparently occurring in the mountains of Iran, or Iraq. So what you have here is what is called a dhikr, or remembrance. The process of doing so is often a way of conjuring or remembering God, remembering the nature of God, etc., by through rhythmic repetition, through movement, through dance, to achieve a sort of state of spiritual union. Now, that specific dhikr or remembrance changes from order to order. Often these orders had their own lodges, which were sometimes in the countryside, but sometimes also in cities. These lodges were called khankas or zawiyas or tekkes, like this one, very large one, you should see called the Arabati Baba Tekke in Macedonia today. Here's another one. This is a tekke in Sarajevo that I went to. And you can see this one's in the middle, or would have been on the edges of the city, but is now in the middle of the city. The leader of a Sufi lodge is called a sheikh or a post nashim. Post is animal hide, nishin in Persian for to sit. So someone who sits on usually the tiger skin, as you can see here. And he has disciples who would be called murids. And there's all sorts of different sheikhs, each one with different regalia and so forth. This is a Bektashi sheikh, again, in Macedonia, at the Arabati Baba Tekke, and this is me visiting him. So again, at the core of the Sufi ceremony is a practice called dhikr, in which you're supposed to remember God and ideally achieve a sort of ecstatic state called hal. And there, as you saw, there are basically various ways of doing this. Sometimes it's just vocal, so just reciting one of the names of God thousands of times over until you reach this state. Other times it's through poetry. So again, reciting poetry of sacred poetry of Sufi figures again and again until people reach the state. Other times it's musical, so accompanied by music, and it's the music that helps drive you into the state. And other times it's gestural, so basically spinning or moving the body in one way to transform oneself. This is the Mevlevi that maybe is probably the most famous one that is known, also known as the whirling dervishes. This one is done by essentially spinning. There would be a band accompanying this. And you can see here there's basically a stage because the Mevlevi lodges eventually became almost like theaters where people would sit on the first floor or second floor on the first floor and observe these Sufis turning themselves into the sticker, which basically they'll be rotating again and again and again while moving in a circle. all along to the accompaniment of music. And this is a picture from probably the 19th century, trying to show the aspect of movement. And again, you always have an audience in the background. Of course, other forms, not necessarily of the Mevlevis. This is a Sufi in the state in Sudan, recently depicted. And of course, there's vocal dhikr groups like this one. These looks like Central Asians in the 19th century. This is a dhikr of a Qadri movement held in Cape Town. So if you listen, you can see they're saying "Huwa, Huwa," which just means he. There's various films about this. Especially if there is musical accompaniment, it's called a sama, or an audition, a hearing, right? And it's the music that is driving people to madness. And here we see a depiction of this. This person is, in a sense, drunk, perhaps figuratively, or for in this case, actually, has a wine glass and a wine bottle. And they've driven themselves into a state of drunkenness on the love of God, to the point where they've also thrown off their turban and are walking around without any head covering. Here's another depiction of a similar situation. Here, the musicians, this is probably the sheikh, and here's the Sufi disciples or participants in the dhikr, trying to achieve or throwing themselves into an ecstatic state in which they would, again, essentially faint or throw off their headgear, or be driven into a state of union. Here's an unfinished miniature depicting it and some angels coming to visit. We have different things. Looks like over here, this guy is being held while in this state, in this ecstatic state. Now, Sufism isn't just about dhikr. It's also an entire vision of the world in which God can be present in daily people's lives, and he's unusually present in some people, in his friends. These friends are called wali, or in plural awliya in Arabic. In Turkish called veli or evliya. And basically that some people, there's a spiritual elite in the world, and they just have a closer connection to God. And if they're particularly powerful, they can even ask God for favors to intervene in our world, in our material world, and create what are known as karamat, or miracles. In this sense, they're probably the closest equivalent to what is known in Christianity as saints. Because the basic idea is that everyday people can't access the secret of God's unity. All this information given to Sufis, etc., is not meant for just anyone. And in fact, if the everyday Muslim tries to do it, they'll probably end up leading themselves astray and doing something weird or heretical. And so the Sufis are already by themselves a sort of elect. Now, there's always the question of how do you decide if you're really part of an elite or not. But they see themselves as sort of a spiritual elite, the khasa, and within that, there's even a higher spiritual elite, people who have a particularly close connection to God. These are the friends of God again. And you can ask these friends of God to intercede in this world by asking God for favors and performing miracles, what are called the karamat. Now, the best place to ask for intercession, because these friends of God continue to influence the world even after their death, is at their graves. And often their graves are marked by domes, which signify that it's a holy place. So we see the domes here and there. They're peppered and all over in the middle of cities, in the middle of the countryside. Probably every village has one, and you can find them. They're basically local spots of spirituality. And even most villages would not have a mosque, but they would probably have the shrine of, some holy man from the village, or some prophet, or some person attached to the village that people could then go and pray at. That's just another remnant of a tomb in the countryside outside of Tokat in Turkey. So how would people come and pray? They basically come, they say the Fatiha, or they do different prayers in front of the graves. They might kiss the grave, asking directly for the saint, for the friend of God, to intervene in their lives. And as I said, you can find these graves and tombs everywhere, like this one in the Bulgarian countryside. This is Uyghur men, China, praying in a grave in Xinjiang. In all likelihood, this grave has been destroyed by the Chinese government by this point. But you can see there's probably a grave around this tree, and there's cloths and things tied around to mark it. Graves are interesting because they're not just spaces that Muslims visit, but actually are often visited by all sorts of different people. So, for example, this grave in Morocco is basically a site of shared visitation by both Jews and Muslims. But often, as we'll see in Anatolia, Christians also came to holy sites or holy shrines frequented by Muslims. And often these holy shrines originally were, spaces of local saints, shrines dedicated to figures like Elias, Elijah, or St. George, etc., that became then transformed into Muslim shrines around certain figures. And the same happens in South Asia, where you have shrines that are visited by both Hindus and Muslims. This is what it might look like inside, where you have multiple graves, different founders and disciples and different masters over time. Now, as I said, there's different Sufi orders, and they tend to concentrate in specific geographic areas. So for our purposes, in Anatolia, there is a variety of Sufi orders here: the Halwatis, the Halwatiya, the Mevlevis, the Malwaiya, the Bektashis, and a variety of others. But these are some of the ones that tend to predominate in Anatolia. But for example, if you were to go to North Africa, there's a very strong influence of the Shazaliya, or in Egypt, the Badawi or the Wafaiya. And we can see here basically that there's different parts. India is very closely aligned with Chishtiya. Part of that's because of patronage of certain orders by imperial governments during the period we're looking at, basically the 1500s and 1600s. One of the strongest orders and most important one in Anatolia was that of one founded by Jalaluddin Rumi. You may have heard of Rumi. His poetry is often translated into English in a very New Agey way. But he was one of these Sufi masters who migrated from Iran to Anatolia in the 1200s, for maybe a bit earlier. And he ended up settling in Konya, which was the capital of the Seljuks, the dynasty that ruled the center of Anatolia after the Battle of Manzikert. And there, with imperial patronage and support, he managed to create an entire order and expand his reach across large parts of Anatolia. That said, he was always actually viewed by suspicion by the Ottomans, at least until the 1500s. But that's getting after the fact that after he established his order and well after he died. You can still go to his tomb, which is in the center of Konya today. It's still a very nice place. And his order is called the Mevlevis or the Maulawis, and that's because it was called after the name that he was most often referred to as Maulana, which literally means our Lord or our teacher. In Turkish, you would say Mavlana. And so his students were called Mevlevis. And the type of dhikr that he was most commonly associated with is the spinning dervish one. You can see here basically him being shown in a position of honor. And on the left here, there's this sort of what's called a kind of a wandering calendar dervish, sort of one who's, as we'll see, is antinomian. He's wearing just a animal skin and he doesn't have much on him. Whereas he is, in a very formal garment. He has a very large turban, and he's being greeted by all sorts of important people. Here's another depiction of him, a story of how Salahuddin the goldsmith is prostrating himself in front of Jalaluddin Rumi. Through these stories, his legend is spread and people learn about all his activities. But again, you can see just how luxurious his clothing is and the type of imperial Sufism that he represented. And this is the dhikr that he's most closely associated with, that of the Mevlevis, which is this worthy dervishes. Here's another picture that I took of Mevlevi dervish today in Istanbul. And as you can point out, you can go to his tomb in Konya and see it. And it's built in a specific way. It's covered in these turquoise tiles on the outside. And this is to be reminiscent of the way that sultans, especially Timurid or Central Asian Iranian sultans, were building their tombs at the period. So they would create these domes covered in blue tile, turquoise tile work. And it goes to show you just how important these Sufi sheikhs were. Often they're able to combine political power and spiritual power. And in fact, many of them became political leaders. They were considered, sultan of the afterlife, just as, maybe the sultan ruling the kingdom was considered the sultan of this world. And ideally, a Sufi master or the head Sufi sheikh could gain enough followers, enough prestige that he could rival governments himself. And this happened on a number of occasions, as we'll see. As I pointed out, Rumi's poetry is actually constantly translated into English in this sort of New Agey version. So for example, this quote, "The one I love is everywhere." Or here, "Yesterday I was clever, so I wanted to change the world. Today I'm wise, so I'm changing myself." In this context, these pieces of poetry, which he sent out and circulate across the Anatolian countryside in the medieval period, seem to mean nothing, or at least are kind of empty visions of spirituality. If you were to actually read the entire poems and read them in a less decontextualized way, you would get a better sense of what he's trying to say. And in this sense, a colleague of mine went and translated some of his poetry, some lines, and put some of his more not nice insults into translation. So, for example, Rumi also wrote this one. "He who lives a sweet life dies a bitter death. The fattest sheep is fittest for the kill." And obviously, this is a moment against a type of sentiment against luxury, and in the connections here. Ultimately, if you fall into the sea, you hypocrite, you're so ugly, no serpent or whale will eat you. So this is just like an attack on probably an enemy, or what he, just any sort of hypocrites that he was confounded by, people he didn't like in the course of his life. So that is a very quick overview of Sufism. We're going to talk more concretely about Sufism in medieval Anatolia in a second, or at least in the next lesson. But I do also want to give a sense of Shi'ism. Now, what is Shi'ism? You might know Shi'ism as a type of Islam or sect of Islam most popular today in Iran, in which the government is formally Shi'i. And this is a breakdown of Shi'i populations in the world today. But back then, let's say back in 1200 or 1300, this map wasn't quite accurate. For example, Iran was mostly Sunni, the other major sect, and it wasn't actually formally Shi'i yet. Instead, there were small groups of Shi'is in the mountains of Lebanon and Syria, and also just spread across the world. Now, what does it actually mean to be Shi'i, and what does that have to do with medieval Anatolia? In the most basic sense, Shi'ism derives from a debate during the early Islamic period over the lineage, the breakdown of who's going to take power after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. There was a variety of different figures, close companions of the Prophet Muhammad, who took power, took control of the community. The first one is called Abu Bakr, then another one called Omar, and then Uthman, and then Ali. Ali was actually the son-in-law and the cousin of the Prophet Muhammad. And some people believe because he had this close connection, direct connection to the Prophet Muhammad, he was actually a more fitting leader than these other three guys. And in fact, the chain of command should have gone to him first. The chain of succession should have gone to Ali first, rather than through Omar, Abu Bakr, and Uthman. And so, in the most basic sense, it's a question of lineages of succession. It kind of started this way, basically political allegiances and questions, but it became something else. And over the centuries, it became more about different visions of leadership and different visions of religiosity. By the way, Ali ended up taking power as the fourth successor. And there's two major battles in which he was involved. His rule is challenged by a guy named Muawiyah. The first is in Siffin in 657. This battle doesn't conclude with any clear winner. And in fact, they agree to have basically to have an arbitration. In the process of the arbitration meetings, Ali is actually killed by a sort of follower of his who believed that he shouldn't have abandoned his claim to arbitration. You don't have to know this, but anyways, Ali is killed then. It's kind of passed on to his leadership is passed on to his son, who at different points tries to reclaim leadership and is killed outside of a battle called Karbala, in a place called Karbala, which is today in Iraq. His son Hussein is killed. And these two moments are commemorated by people who believe that Ali was the rightful and direct heir of the Prophet Muhammad. Hold on. So not only was he connected to the Prophet Muhammad because through marriage, marrying Muhammad's only living daughter, Fatima, but he was also his cousin. And basically descendants of Ali through his son Hussein, and then other people like Ali Zain al-Abidin, Abu Bakr, continued to lead a community of Muslims who saw themselves as and believe that the best way to lead the community, the most important qualification for leading the Muslim community is connection, whether through family or lineage, to the Prophet Muhammad. And then this was the most important manner. And this is in contrast to let's say, the mainstream Sunnis, who believe that actually we should follow the example of the Prophet Muhammad. And we know that because we follow the teachings of scholars who studied the actions and beliefs of the Prophet Muhammad. Long story short, there's 12 so-called imams. This eventually ends. The last imam goes into what's called occultation. Um, and what ends up happening is that Ali becomes a general venerated figure amongst Shi'is, uh, partially because his close connection to Prophet Muhammad, and you want to be, ideally for Muslims, to be as closely connected to the Prophet Muhammad as you can. And so Ali is the most direct connection to achieve that. And this general sentiment, being close to the Prophet Muhammad through Ali, through his son-in-law, is a sentiment shared by many Muslims, even if they're not formally Shi'i. And by that I mean that Shi'is went on to develop their own institutions, their own theology, etc. But a lot of people just liked Ali in general and liked the idea of connecting to Muhammad through him. And these people with what have pro-Ali inclinations are called Alids. And just to think, they're not necessarily Shi'is, they're just people that believe in Ali as a particularly holy person. So that's a very quick overview of Sunnism and Shiism. I know it might not have been clear, but just keep that in mind as we go through and speak more in the course of this class.